Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on a truly massive, yet totally invisible engine that drives the global tourism industry. Think about it. When you travel somewhere new, you want to feel welcomed, right? You want to feel understood and inspired to get out there and explore. But how does that magic actually happen across huge language barriers? We often assume it's just someone swapping out words, or maybe just relying on a translation app. But there is actually a highly strategic, hidden art to tourism translation. So today, we're going to unpack the mechanics behind this invisible art and help you build your very own translator's toolkit. Here's our itinerary for today. We'll start by tackling the unique hurdles of translating the world of tourism. Then we'll dive into 3 heavy-hitting theoretical tools that the pros use: Skopos, equivalence, and relevance. And to wrap it all up, we'll put these theories into practice so you can actually use them. Let's get right into it.
Starting with our first stop, translating the world of tourism, and why literal just isn't always better.
So, translation is literally the backbone of global travel. But it is definitely not a simple math equation where you just swap an English word for the exact dictionary equivalent in French or Japanese. A rigid, robotic, word-for-word translation totally fails to capture the actual cultural allure needed to persuade people. In fact, when you're dealing with very different cultural expectations, a completely literal translation can actually alienate your audience instead of drawing them in. All the magic just gets completely lost in translation. Which of course begs the question, how do we actually fix a bad literal translation? How do the pros build a toolkit for cross-cultural communication that actually inspires someone to pack their bags, book a flight, and go? Well, let's look at our first major theoretical tool.
Moving to Skopos, or purpose-driven translation. What is the actual goal of the text? When you're analyzing any translation, the very first question you have to ask is about its goal. I absolutely love this quote from translation scholar Christiane Nord from back in 1997. She says, "The basic principle which determines the process of translation is the purpose, or Skopos, of the translational action." Think about it. When a travel agency writes a brochure, they aren't just reciting geographical facts. Their true intention is to sell an experience.
And that brings us to the absolute heart of Skopos theory. Developed by Hans Vermeer in 1978, the word Skopos is literally Greek for purpose. This theory argues that you absolutely must tailor a translation to its intended function in the target culture. So, if a promotional flyer is trying to persuade a specific demographic, the translator is going to prioritize culturally alluring, persuasive language over strict, literal accuracy just to hit the right notes for that audience. Let's ground this with a concrete example. Imagine an English promotional flyer for a cultural tour that ends with something like a memorable experience for travelers of all ages. Pretty standard, right? But a Skopos-driven translator adapting this for an Arabic-speaking audience knows that demographic places a massive premium on family-oriented activities. So, to achieve the ultimate purpose, which is attracting those travelers, the adaptation specifically emphasizes family connections and traditional values, totally ditching that generic all-ages phrasing.
When you break down the strategy here, the transformation is brilliant. The Arabic translation adjusts the phrasing to perfectly align with cultural expressions of hospitality, which is a huge cornerstone in Arab cultures. Ordinary words like explore or enjoy are modified to create a deeply warm, personal invitation. The whole purpose, the Skopos, is to persuade by genuinely resonating with the reader's cultural values.
But hang on. What if the goal isn't just to inform or persuade based on some broad cultural purpose? What if the goal is to perfectly replicate a highly specific emotional impact, a distinct vibe from the original text?
That takes us to equivalence, capturing the experience, or mirroring the vibe, not just the words.
Equivalence theory is entirely about mirroring that feeling. As scholar Anthony Pym defined it in 2010, equivalence is a relation of equal value between a source text and a target text. There's actually an entire lineage of scholars going all the way back to the 1950s, arguing that we shouldn't be stubbornly adhering to the source language's structure. Instead, we have to chase this equal value across the language barrier.
So in everyday practice, equivalence theory is all about conveying the exact same meaning and emotional impact as the original. And that often means you have to completely adapt idioms or cultural references that don't have direct translations. It's not about mirroring vocabulary, it's about mirroring the emotional response. If the original English makes you feel pampered and incredibly relaxed, the translated text needs to evoke that exact same sigh of relief, even if it has to use totally different imagery to get you there.
Let's do another comparison. Imagine an English ad saying,
Come visit our breathtaking seaside resort, where you can enjoy sun-soaked beaches, indulge in delicious local cuisine, and unwind with luxurious spa treatments. Experience the vacation of a lifetime. To translate this using equivalence theory, the translator intentionally avoids getting locked into a word-for-word trap. Instead, they carefully select phrasing that captures that precise, irresistible allure. They want the reader to feel the exact same magnetic pull toward the beach.
If you stacked the literal word-for-word approach right up against the emotional equal value approach, the difference is basically night and day. By focusing intensely on replicating the emotional impact, the translated content becomes infinitely more effective at drawing tourists in. The appeal skyrockets because they aren't just reading a translated sentence, they are experiencing a translated feeling.
Okay, but what if we run into a totally different problem? Imagine reading about a completely unfamiliar cultural concept. What happens when your target audience entirely lacks the cultural context for the experience you're trying to describe? That creates a massive knowledge gap. So how do we make sure the message still lands?
Enter relevance theory. Context is everything. It's time to bridge that knowledge gap.
Relevance theory is the ultimate bridge for this problem. Developed by Dan Sperber and Deirdre Wilson in 1986, it revolves around a very practical idea. Communication simply has to align with the audience's expectations and specific cultural background. The translator essentially stands directly between the writer and the reader, carefully managing the cognitive realities of both to find the absolute best possible connection.
For example, think about an English brochure for Charleston, South Carolina that casually mentions enjoying its delicious Southern cuisine. Now, to an American, that immediately conjures up a whole world of specific flavors and history, but to someone overseas, Southern cuisine might mean absolutely nothing. So a smart translator cleverly expands the text, explaining it specifically as delicious dishes like shrimp and corn grits. They step in and provide the necessary mouth-watering context that was completely missing.
The writer's original assumption was that the audience inherently knew what Southern food was, but the translator's action, guided by relevance theory, adds that crucial culinary context to actually make it meaningful. And that simple addition dramatically increases the chances that a prospective tourist will understand the appeal. Because let's be real, if you don't even know what the food is, you're certainly not going to fly halfway across the world just to eat it.
All right, it's time for putting theories into practice. Let's open up your translator's toolkit.
We've covered Skopos, equivalence, and relevance, and now I want to challenge you to be an active observer next time you take a vacation. It's a three-step process. First, grab 2 translated tourism materials, maybe a museum brochure or a menu. Second, compare the original text with the translated version and actively hunt for those hidden cultural nuances we've been talking about. And third, figure out which theory explains why it works. Is Skopos driving a persuasive purpose? Is equivalence perfectly mirroring an emotion? Or is relevance bridging a massive knowledge gap? I guarantee you'll start seeing this invisible art absolutely everywhere.
Which leaves us with one final provocative question. The next time you travel, what invisible, purposeful translation choices will you spot in the signs around you? Once you actually know what to look for, the world of global tourism becomes just infinitely more fascinating. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep your eyes open out there, stay curious, and I'll see you next time.